A 16-year-old girl. A dark alley. 9 stab wounds, though her jacket showed she'd been slashed over 20 times. But here's what nobody knew at her funeral: her killer was sitting right there in the pews. He was shaking hands with her parents. He was crying. He was comforting them. For 21 years, this predator walked free while detectives chased ghosts. Then they found his diary. And what was written inside would expose a twisted mind that had been hunting women for decades. This is the case that took 2 decades to solve, and the killer who almost got away with murder. January 18, 1993. Greenhithe, Kent. A small town where everyone knew everyone, where teenage girls walked to friends' houses without a second thought, where the biggest excitement was the upcoming GCSE exams. Claire Tiltman had just turned 16 4 days earlier. Just 4 days. She was still riding that birthday high, still basking in the milestone that meant freedom, independence, the promise of adulthood stretching before her like an open road. Her friends at Dartford Grammar School for Girls affectionately called her Tilts. They described her as beautiful, funny, ambitious, someone who drew people to her with an infectious laugh and a wicked sense of humor. She wasn't just popular, she was genuinely beloved. Claire lived with her parents, Cliff and Linda, in Woodward Terrace, Stone, just outside Greenhithe. She was their only child, their entire world. They were what you'd call protective parents, the kind who worried, who kept her close. But Claire had just turned 16. Surely she could walk less than a mile to a friend's house to study. It was supposed to be simple. A Monday evening walk. She left home around 6 p.m., planning to meet her friend in Riverview Road. The route was familiar, safe, or so everyone thought. Claire was completing her Bronze Duke of Edinburgh award at Dartford Fire Station, harboring dreams of becoming a firefighter someday. She was the kind of girl who wanted to save people, to make a difference. She would never get that chance. Around 6:20 p.m., as dusk settled over the quiet streets of Greenhithe, Claire decided to make a quick detour. She wanted to buy cigarettes from a shop off Knockhall Chase. It was just a small deviation from her route. A decision that would cost her everything. As she walked back down London Road, she cut through a dark alleyway, a shortcut, barely 100 steps from the main road. The kind of place you'd walk through 1,000 times without incident. But on that January evening, someone was waiting. The attack was swift. Brutal. Unimaginably violent. Claire was set upon from behind in a frenzied assault that would later be described by prosecutors as remorseless and carried out with clear intention to kill. Her attacker plunged a knife into her body 9 times, deep wounds to her chest, back, and neck, some measuring up to 15 centimeters deep. But the violence didn't stop there. Her jacket bore evidence of over 20 slashing motions, suggesting a fury that went beyond murder into something darker, something personal in its savagery. Despite her catastrophic injuries, Claire managed to stagger out of the alleyway. Perhaps she was hoping to reach the main road, to find help, to survive. She collapsed on the pavement shortly after 6:20 p.m. Passers-by discovered her almost immediately. A nurse who happened to be nearby dropped to her knees and attempted resuscitation. Others called for an ambulance from the local pub. But Claire's wounds were too severe. The knife had found vital organs, severed major blood vessels. By the time paramedics arrived, Claire Tiltman was already gone. The scene was chaos. Blood pooled on the pavement. The dark alleyway off the A226 London Road became a crime scene, cordoned off with police tape as investigators descended on the quiet suburb. Within hours, floral tributes began to appear. Hundreds of them, left by neighbors, friends, strangers, all shocked that such violence could erupt in their peaceful community. Kent police launched Operation Artist, what would become the largest murder investigation in the force's history. Detective teams canvassed the neighborhood, taking over 1,500 witness statements. They issued public appeals. Claire's photograph appeared on front pages across the nation. The police offered a £1,000 reward for information. Witnesses came forward describing a man in a light-colored jacket near the scene. Some mentioned seeing a distinctive white Ford Capri in the area around the time of the attack. But the evidence was frustratingly sparse. No fingerprints. No DNA. No murder weapon recovered. The pathologist's report painted a grim picture. Claire had been attacked from behind while wearing her zipped-up jacket. The assault was rapid, mere seconds of unrelenting violence. The killer had struck and vanished like smoke. The community was paralyzed with fear. If this could happen to Claire Tiltman, bright, beloved Claire who was just walking to a friend's house, it could happen to anyone. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone. The streets of Greenhithe, once safe and familiar, suddenly felt menacing. Early theory suggested the killer might have known Claire. The location of the attack, the timing, the specific targeting, it all pointed to something more than random violence. But investigators couldn't establish a connection to anyone in her life who would want to hurt her. As weeks turned to months, the leads dried up. The case, despite its high profile and intensive investigation, began to grow cold. What the police didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the killer had already begun inserting himself into the investigation. The attack on Claire Tiltman wasn't random. It wasn't a one-time explosion of violence. It was the work of a serial predator who had been perfecting his craft for years. Rewind to December 21, 1988. Just over 4 years before Claire's murder. Swanscombe, Kent, less than 2 miles from the alleyway where Claire would eventually die. A 27-year-old woman was waiting for a bus in the early hours of the morning when a man approached her. He had a gun. And a knife. He forced her into his car at gunpoint and drove her to a nearby quarry. What happened next was the stuff of nightmares. At the isolated quarry, he attempted to rape her. Multiple times. When she resisted, when his attempts failed, his frustration turned to rage. He tried to strangle her with his school tie, an old relic from his youth. But the tie ripped in two. So he flipped her onto her stomach and stabbed her 5 times in the back, leaving her for dead in the dark. But she survived. Miraculously, she managed to roll down the quarry slope and alert nearby workmen. She was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life. She gave police a description: a man in his early 20s, fair-haired, around 6 feet tall, wearing a beige jacket. The attack was horrifying in its cruelty, but the predator remained unidentified. The case went unsolved, filed away as another violent crime in the area. Then came January 18, 1993. Claire Tiltman. And the pattern continued. On October 17, 1995, 2 years after Claire's murder, the predator struck again. This time, his victim was Charlotte Barnard, a 21-year-old healthcare assistant walking home after an evening with friends in Greenhithe. She was on Station Road when he appeared. He dragged her, screaming, off the street and stabbed her repeatedly, 14 times. 8 wounds to her back, 1 to her flank, 5 defensive wounds to her hand as she desperately tried to protect herself. The location. Less than 400 meters from where Claire Tiltman was murdered. Charlotte survived. And this time, witnesses saw the attacker fleeing the scene in a white Ford Capri. They got a license plate number. Police tracked the car to a house in Swanscombe, where they arrested a 27-year-old man named Colin Ash-Smith. Finally, they had him. Colin Stephen Ash-Smith. Local milkman. Son of 2 former labor councillors, his mother Diane had even served as mayor. By all outward appearances, he was just another face in the community. But when police searched his white Ford Capri, they found something chilling: half of an old school tie. The same tie that had been used in the 1988 quarry attack on the 27-year-old woman. The tie that had ripped in two when the attacker tried to strangle his victim. In Ash-Smith's home, detectives discovered something even more disturbing: a collection of 20 to 30 knives. Commando knives. Sheath knives. Flick knives. An arsenal of blades. And then they found the diary. Handwritten pages detailing assault plans, meticulous records of his attacks on women. He rated each one like a performance review. The 1988 quarry attack. He called it his masterpiece, giving it a 95% success rating. He wrote, "My last attack, what wasn't planned." Other entries described attempted attacks that didn't go according to plan. An aborted assault at Swanscombe railway station received a 50% rating. He wrote, "I bottled it. Lucky for her I did, I suppose." There were accounts of stalking women, breaking into a home and cutting up a woman's clothes in her laundry basket before fleeing when he heard her husband. He described his psycho state of mind with disturbing casualness, as if he were merely documenting a hobby. Most chilling of all, in one entry, he wrote that he wanted to kill a schoolgirl. It sounds impressive. In December 1996, Ash-Smith pleaded guilty to the 1988 and 1995 attacks. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 to 21 years. The sentencing judge called him far too dangerous to be at large, noting his aggressive and sadistic fantasies. But throughout it all, Ash-Smith maintained one consistent claim: he had nothing to do with Claire Tiltman's murder. Investigators didn't believe him. The similarities were too striking: lone women, knives, frenzied violence, attacks in the same small geographic area. But they had a problem: no physical evidence. No DNA. No witnesses placing him at the scene. No murder weapon. And then there was his alibi. On January 19, 1993, the day after Claire was murdered, Ash-Smith called the police incident room. He claimed he'd been driving through Greenhithe around 6:30 p.m. the evening before and had seen someone with curly hair using a pedestrian crossing near where Claire was attacked. It seemed like helpful information from a concerned citizen. But investigators later realized it was something else entirely: a preemptive alibi. Ash-Smith feared that he or his distinctive white Ford Capri might have been spotted in the area. So he called police to create a plausible reason for his presence. 6 days later, when police questioned him more formally, his mother Diane provided an alibi: Colin had been driving her home after they'd delivered leaflets to constituents. They'd been home by 6 p.m., she said. The alibi held. For years, it held. What police didn't know at the time was that Diane Ash-Smith's statement was false. She would later admit on television that she'd lied to protect her son. Her husband, Aubrey, also a former counselor, took it a step further. When police were scheduled to search their home, he destroyed a knife belonging to Colin. He dismantled it, boiled it to remove forensic evidence, and threw the pieces into bushes. Aubrey Ash-Smith was eventually sentenced to 12 months in prison for perverting the course of justice. But the damage was done. The original knife, potentially the murder weapon, was gone forever. Without physical evidence and with an alibi from his mother, Colin Ash-Smith couldn't be charged with Claire's murder. The case remained open, but it was effectively cold. Meanwhile, there was something else investigators discovered. Something that would haunt Claire's family for years. Colin Ash-Smith had attended Claire's funeral. He knew the Tiltman family through the local Royal British Legion Club. He'd even played billiards with Claire a few times. And on the day of her funeral at Eltham Crematorium on February 25, 1993, Colin Ash-Smith arrived wearing a beige jacket, the same jacket he'd worn the night he murdered her. He sat in the pews. He shook hands with Cliff and Linda. He offered condolences. He cried. And then he went home, believing he'd gotten away with murder. For Claire's parents, the years that followed were a living nightmare. Linda Tiltman described it at a press conference shortly after the murder: "People have asked me how I am. All I can say is what I have said to the doctor and everyone else: do you have a tablet for a broken heart? There was no tablet. No cure. Just the unbearable weight of losing their only child and knowing her killer walked free." Cliff and Linda became tireless advocates for justice. They kept Claire's case in the public eye, giving interviews, making appeals, never letting anyone forget their daughter. But the toll was immense. Linda developed cancer and died in March 2008 at the age of 56. Cliff developed 5 inoperable tumors and died in September 2012 at 62. Both requested that their ashes not be buried with Claire's until her killer was caught and convicted. They died without seeing justice. But Claire's friends refused to let her memory fade. Lisa Gribben, Joan Roberts, Vicky Atkins, Emma Edwards, and several other school friends formed the Justice for Claire campaign. They launched a website. They organized annual memorial events. On the 20th anniversary of Claire's death in January 2013, they held a candlelit walk that retraced her final steps, beginning at the Bull Pub on London Road and concluding with a service at St. Mary's Church in Greenhithe. Hundreds attended, carrying candles and torches, many holding copies of the newspaper front page from 1993 that featured Claire's smiling face. The campaign raised money for charities close to Claire's heart, the Firefighters Charity and Ellen Alliance Hospice, where Linda had received care. The Friends' persistence kept pressure on Kent police. The case underwent regular cold case reviews every 2 years. In 2005, emerging DNA profiling technology was applied to exhibits from the crime scene, clothing, scene samples, but no matches were found. In 2010, the Cold Case Unit received Home Office funding to re-examine the evidence with modern forensic techniques. But it wasn't forensics that would break the case. It was a conversation in a prison cell. Between 2001 and 2003, Colin Ash-Smith was housed at HMP Wakefield, serving his sentence for the 1988 and 1995 attacks. His cellmate was a convicted sex offender named Stephen Du Bois. The two men bonded over shared interests, Dungeons and Dragons, fantasy games. And one day, in the casual way that criminals sometimes confess, Ash-Smith told Du Bois about an attack. He said he'd once seen a girl on a zebra crossing, snapped, and attacked her. At the time, Du Bois assumed Ash-Smith was referring to one of the crimes he'd already been convicted of. But years later, when Du Bois was interviewed as part of the Cold Case Review, investigators realized something crucial. There was no zebra crossing near either the 1988 quarry attack or the 1995 attack on Charlotte Barnard. But there was a zebra crossing near where Claire Tiltman was murdered. Claire was the only one of Ash-Smith's known victims to have used a pedestrian crossing. This was the missing link. Armed with Du Bois's testimony, investigators re-examined everything. They searched Ash-Smith's family home in September 2013 and found a copy of the local newspaper marking the first anniversary of Claire's death, a macabre trophy he'd kept for over 2 decades. They rechecked his alibi. His mother's statement about delivering leaflets. It fell apart under scrutiny. The timeline didn't work. Ash-Smith couldn't have been home by 6 p.m. as claimed. But there was still a legal problem. Before 2003, British law prohibited prosecutors from using a defendant's previous criminal convictions as evidence of guilt in a new case. It was considered too prejudicial, too likely to bias a jury. But the Criminal Justice Act 2003 changed that. It allowed bad character evidence, previous convictions and admissions, to be presented in court if they demonstrated a pattern of behavior relevant to the current charge. This was one of the first major murder cases where that new law would be tested. On February 12, 2014, the Crown Prosecution Service announced they had sufficient evidence to charge Colin Ash-Smith with Claire Tiltman's murder. The timing was deliberate. It was the same day Ash-Smith was scheduled to appear before the parole board for his other convictions. After 21 years, justice was finally within reach. The trial began on November 3, 2014, at Inner London Crown Court in Southwark. It would last 5 weeks. Prosecutor Brian Altman QC laid out the Crown's case with devastating clarity. Colin Ash-Smith was a ruthless predatory armed killer who took pleasure in violence against women. He killed Claire Tiltman for the sake of killing, for the warped satisfaction it gave him, for the feeling of power and control. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, but it formed a compelling pattern. The diary. Jurors heard excerpts from Ash-Smith's assault plans, including his desire to kill a schoolgirl because it sounds impressive. They heard about his 95% success rating for the 1988 attack, his meticulous documentation of stalking behavior. The pattern: 3 attacks, 1988, 1993, 1995, all against lone women, all involving knives, all within a small geographic area. All characterized by extreme, frenzied violence. The prison confession. Stephen Du Bois testified about Ash-Smith's statement regarding the girl on the zebra crossing. Under cross-examination, he admitted potential confusion due to medication and the passage of time, but stood by the core of his account. The false alibi. Evidence showed Ash-Smith's call to police the day after the murder was a calculated move to explain his potential presence in the area. His mother's statement about being home by 6 p.m. was demonstrably false. The funeral. Photographs showed Ash-Smith at Claire's funeral, wearing the same beige jacket witnesses had described seeing near the crime scene, the same jacket he'd worn during his other attacks. The defense, led by David Nathan QC, argued there was no direct physical evidence linking Ash-Smith to Claire's murder. They pointed to serial killer Robert Napper, who'd murdered Rachel Nichol in 1992 and the Bissets in 1993 using similar frenzied stabbing methods. Could Napper have killed Claire too? But prosecutors noted key differences. Napper's attacks had sexual components. Claire's murder showed no evidence of sexual assault. It was pure violence, pure power, exactly matching Ash-Smith's documented pattern. Ash-Smith himself took the stand. He described himself as an animal when discussing his previous victims. He admitted to carrying knives on midnight walks after his parents went to bed, looking for opportunities to attack. He spoke of his knife collection, his stalking behavior, his obsessive fantasies. But he insisted, repeatedly, that he had nothing to do with Claire Tiltman's murder. The jury didn't believe him. After 5 weeks of evidence, deliberations took just 3.5 hours. On December 11, 2014, Colin Ash-Smith was found guilty of murdering Claire Tiltman. When the verdict was read, the Justice for Claire group, Lisa Gribben, Joanne Roberts, Vicky Atkins, and others, sat in the courtroom holding photographs of their friend. They wore Justice for Claire wristbands. After 21 years, they'd finally done it. When it came time for victim impact statements, Ash-Smith refused to leave his cell. He wouldn't face the people he'd destroyed. So prosecutor Brian Altman read the statements aloud. Claire's uncle, Roger Tiltman, spoke of how all the family's hopes and dreams had disappeared that January night. Cliff and Linda had always been protective of Claire, but they'd decided that at 16, she deserved more freedom. That decision, to let her walk to a friend's house, had haunted them with massive amounts of guilt. Roger believed that guilt, that stress, that unbearable grief had led to Cliff and Linda's early deaths. It is very sad, he wrote, that Cliff and Lynn could not be in court today to see the person who killed Claire has finally been brought to justice. Lisa Gribben's statement described Claire as beautiful and loyal, with a wicked sense of humor. She recalled returning to school after the murder. All of her friends would just stare at Claire's empty chair. We were just devastated. But the Justice for Claire group also included a collective statement that struck a different tone. They wrote, Claire was beautiful, funny, and ambitious with an amazing sense of humor which will always live in our memories. Today we want to reclaim our friend and remember her for the wonderful person she was rather than what happened to her. Even in this moment of justice, they chose to honor Claire's life, not just her death. On December 12, 2014, Mr. Justice Sweeney sentenced Colin Ash-Smith to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Had the murder occurred after 2003, when sentencing laws changed, the minimum term would have been 30 years. But the judge had to sentence according to the law as it stood in 1993. Still, it almost didn't matter. Ash-Smith was already serving a life sentence for his previous crimes. With the new murder conviction, he would likely never leave prison. In his sentencing remarks, Mr. Justice Sweeney said, "You not only ended Claire's young life, which was so full of promise, but also caused unbearable grief and upset to her family and friends. This was a premeditated murder. Your intention was to kill. You took a knife to the scene for the purpose, and Claire was vulnerable by reason of her circumstances." In December 2015, Ash-Smith appealed his conviction. Lord Justice Davis, Mr. Justice Warby, and Judge Jeremy Carey reviewed the case and unanimously refused even to grant leave to appeal. They ruled that the diary and assault plans were of significant relevance, and that all the evidence properly pointed to Ash-Smith as Claire's killer. The decision meant Colin Ash-Smith would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The end of the road for any legal challenge. Justice, finally. 21 years late, but finally delivered. Claire Tiltman's murder left scars on Greenhithe that would never fully heal. But in the years following the conviction, the community chose to honor her memory in ways that celebrated her life, not her death. In April 2016, Dartford Borough Council approved the renaming of Fast-Track Manor Way to Tiltman Avenue. The campaign had been led by local residents and Claire's childhood friends, who wanted something positive associated with her name, a daily reminder of the girl who dreamed of becoming a firefighter, who made everyone laugh, who drew people to her. A memorial bench was placed at the scene. A plaque, though it was vandalized and removed in 2003, it stood for years as a quiet tribute. In 2022, Stone Parish Council opened the Claire Tiltman Centre, an eco-friendly community facility on Cotton Lane. The building, surrounded by 4 acres of green space, serves as a base for the local scout group and hosts ecology-led activities for young people. At the opening ceremony, Claire's friend Emma Edwards said, "Obviously there is a lot of pain associated and linked back to how Claire left us. But seeing something like this which is going to have young people doing their Duke of Edinburgh, which is what Claire was doing when she left us, and seeing the difference this is going to make, I hope they will have lots of fun and maybe be a bit mischievous exactly like Claire used to be." In 2023, on the 30th anniversary of her death, Stone Parish Council planted Claire roses at the centre. Kent Police established the Claire Tiltman Investigative Award in April 2016, presented annually to officers demonstrating outstanding investigative work with vulnerable victims and witnesses. The inaugural award was given to Detective Constable Shelley Rayner. It was a fitting tribute, ensuring Claire's name would be forever associated with protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Detective Superintendent Rob Vinson, who led the cold case review, said after the conviction, "Every single one of the Kent police officers who have worked on this case over the last 2 decades have refused to allow Claire's killer to go unaccounted for and escape justice. The investigation team has meticulously built this case over a number of years." The case was featured in several documentaries, including the BBC 4 series The Prosecutors and the Crime Plus investigation series Murder Town. These programs examined how the legal system adapted to allow bad character evidence, how cold case units use modern techniques, and how persistence, from police and from Claire's friends, eventually delivered justice. Claire Tiltman should be in her late 40s now. She should have become a firefighter, just as she dreamed. She should have had a family, a career, a lifetime of laughter and friendship. Instead, she's forever 16. Forever the girl in the school photographs her friends carried to court. Forever Tilts, the one with the wicked sense of humor and the infectious laugh. But she's also something else, a symbol of persistence. Of the friends who never gave up. Of the parents who spent their final years fighting for justice. Of the investigators who refused to let a case go cold. Colin Ash-Smith thought he'd gotten away with murder. He sat in the pews at Claire's funeral, confident in his deception. He kept newspaper clippings as trophies. He walked free for 21 years. But in the end, justice found him. It was delayed, yes. Denied to Cliff and Linda, who died without seeing their daughter's killer convicted. But it was not denied forever. The killer in the pews is now behind bars, where he belongs. Where he'll likely spend the rest of his life. And Claire Tiltman's memory lives on, not in the dark alleyway where her life was stolen, but in the avenue that bears her name, in the eco-center where young people pursue their dreams, in the roses planted in her honor, in the friends who never forgot. As the Justice for Claire group said, "We want to reclaim our friend and remember her for the wonderful person she was." And that is exactly what they did. For Claire. For Cliff. For Linda. For justice delayed, but never denied.